They found what was left of Joe Caruso on a Tuesday morning in October 1958, 3 miles up a forgotten logging road in the Appalachian foothills, where the mist clings to the mountainside like a shroud, and the trees grow so thick that sunlight never quite reaches the forest floor. The local sheriff, a man named Dutch Kellerman, who'd learned long ago not to ask too many questions about certain things, stood over the shallow grave with his hat in his hands and his breakfast threatening to come back up. Joe had been missing for 6 weeks. The dirt was still loose. Someone had covered him with pine branches and creek stones, a half-hearted burial that spoke either of panic or contempt. What troubled Dutch most wasn't the bullet hole behind Joe's left ear, clean and professional. The kind of execution he'd seen twice before in his 30 years wearing a badge. It wasn't even the way Joe's hands had been bound with piano wire, the kind of detail that made it clear this wasn't some hillbilly dispute over moonshine territory. What kept Dutch awake for the next 20 years, until his own death from lung cancer in a veterans hospital outside Roanoke, was the expression frozen on Joe Caruso's face. Not fear, not surprise. Just a terrible, resigned acceptance, as if he'd been expecting this moment for so long that when it finally arrived, all he could feel was relief. The case file gathered dust in the basement of the county courthouse, marked unsolved, though everyone who mattered knew exactly what had happened and why. Some secrets are too expensive to speak aloud. Some debts can only be paid in silence and blood. Before we continue the story of Joe the Mule Caruso and the secrets that followed him from Pittsburgh to these forgotten mountains, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow this story to the end. Joseph Michael Caruso was born in the winter of 1911 in a 3-room tenement in Pittsburgh's Bloomfield neighborhood, where Italian immigrants packed themselves into crumbling brick buildings that smelled of garlic and coal smoke and the perpetual dampness that seeped up from the Allegheny River. His father, Salvatore, worked in the steel mills when work was available, which was less and less as the years ground on. His mother, Francesca, took in laundry and said her rosary with fingers that never quite lost the raw redness from lye soap and cold water. Joe was the youngest of 5 children and the only one who survived past the age of 10. Influenza took his 2 sisters in the epidemic of 1918. His older brothers died in accidents that were common enough in those days not to warrant much investigation. One crushed beneath a collapsed wall at a construction site, another found floating face down in the river after a night of drinking, his pockets empty and his skull fractured. The neighborhood whispered about bad luck, about curses, about God's punishment for sins no one could quite name. By the time Joe turned 15, he understood that survival in Bloomfield required a certain flexibility of conscience. The neighborhood was controlled by men who moved through the streets like shadows, who spoke in dialect and settled disputes with knives and baseball bats. They owned the speakeasies that operated in basements and back rooms, the gambling dens where men lost their wages on cards and dice, the protection rackets that kept businesses safe from the very violence those same men orchestrated. Prohibition had made criminals wealthy and desperate, and the line between the two was thinner than most people wanted to admit. Joe started running errands for a man named Vincent Tagliatore, who operated a social club on Liberty Avenue, where the espresso was strong and the conversations were conducted in whispers. Vincent was in his 40s, soft around the middle but hard in the eyes. A man who'd learned his trade in the old country and perfected it in the new. He needed boys who could keep their mouths shut and their hands steady, boys who understood that loyalty was worth more than money, though money certainly helped. For 2 years, Joe carried messages, delivered packages wrapped in butcher paper, stood watch outside doors while business was conducted behind them. He learned to read faces, to sense danger in the quality of silence, to know when to disappear and when to stand his ground. He learned that respect was earned through reliability, that fear was a tool like any other, and that the men who survived in this world were the ones who could swallow their pride and their questions in equal measure. Vincent paid him well enough, considering $5 a week, sometimes 10 when the work was particularly sensitive. Joe gave half to his mother, who took the money without asking where it came from because hunger makes philosophers of no one. He spent the rest on decent clothes, a haircut every 2 weeks, and the occasional meal at one of the better restaurants downtown, where he could sit at a table with a white cloth and pretend, just for an hour, that he was the kind of man who belonged in such places. The work was simple until it wasn't. In the spring of 1929, Vincent called Joe into the back office of the social club, where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the kind of tension that made Joe's shoulders tighten. There were two other men in the room, both older, both dressed in the expensive suits that marked them as serious people. Vincent introduced them as business associates from New York, though he didn't offer their names, and Joe knew better than to ask. They needed someone to make a run to West Virginia, down into the coal country, where bootleggers moved liquor through mountain passes and hollows that the federal boys couldn't navigate without getting themselves lost or worse. The job paid $100, more money than Joe had ever seen in one place. All he had to do was drive a truck loaded with Canadian whiskey from a warehouse in Pittsburgh to a contact in Logan County, deliver the shipment, collect the payment, and drive back. Simple. Clean. Nothing to worry about. Joe's hands were shaking when he took the keys to the truck. Vincent noticed, smiled that sad, knowing smile he sometimes wore, and put a hand on Joe's shoulder. "Everybody's scared the first time in," he said, his voice quiet enough that the New York men couldn't hear. "The trick is not letting the fear stop you from doing what needs to be done. You do this right, there's more work coming. You do this wrong." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The drive south took 6 hours, following back roads that wound through hills stripped bare by mining operations, past company towns that looked like they'd been built as temporary structures and then forgotten, through valleys where the creeks ran black with coal dust and the air tasted of sulfur and regret. Joe kept his speed steady, his eyes on the road, his mind focused on the $100 that would change everything. He could move his mother out of the tenement. He could buy himself a real future, something beyond delivering packages for men who would kill him without hesitation if he gave them reason. The contact in Logan County was waiting at a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a lean man with hollow cheeks and a shotgun resting across his lap. He counted the cases of whiskey without speaking, then counted out the money in 20s and 10s, the bills worn soft from too many hands. Joe drove back to Pittsburgh as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of a bruise, and felt something shift inside him. Not pride, exactly. More like the recognition that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that whatever he'd been before this drive was gone now, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Vincent was pleased. The New York men were pleased. Over the next 3 years, Joe made the run to West Virginia 17 more times, each trip a little easier, each delivery a little larger. He earned the nickname the Mule, not because he was stubborn or stupid, but because he was reliable, because he could carry a load through difficult terrain without complaining or asking questions. In a world built on secrets and suspicion, reliability was worth its weight in gold. But the mountains of West Virginia had a way of getting into a man's bones, and Joe found himself drawn to the strange, isolated beauty of those hollows and ridges, to the people who lived lives so separate from the city that they might as well have been from another country. He started spending more time down there between runs, making friends with the locals, learning the rhythms of a place where family meant everything and outsiders meant nothing. He met a girl named Sarah McKenna, whose father ran a general store in a town too small to have a name on any map. She had red hair and green eyes, and a laugh that sounded like water running over stones, and when she smiled at Joe, he felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. They married in the summer of 1932, in a Baptist church that smelled of wood polish and summer heat, with half the county in attendance and Vincent Tagliatore conspicuously absent. Joe's mother came down from Pittsburgh for the ceremony, rail-thin and grey-haired at 43, and held Sarah's hands in hers and said a prayer in Italian that neither of the young people understood. She died 3 months later, alone in the tenement apartment, and Joe buried her in a Catholic cemetery, on a hill overlooking the city she'd never quite learned to call home. The marriage changed things. Sarah wanted Joe to stay in West Virginia, to find legitimate work, to build a life that didn't involve men with guns and trucks full of illegal liquor. She was pregnant by October, and the thought of bringing a child into the world terrified Joe in ways that his work for Vincent never had. He promised Sarah he would quit after 1 more year, after he'd saved enough money to buy a piece of land and build a proper house. She believed him because she wanted to, because the alternative was unbearable. But Vincent had other plans. Prohibition ended in 1933, and the men who'd grown wealthy moving illegal alcohol needed to find new sources of income. They moved into gambling, into labor racketeering, into the heroin trade that was beginning to flow through the port cities from Europe and Asia. Vincent brought Joe deeper into the organization, made him a collector, an enforcer, a man who delivered messages that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The money was better. The work was darker. Sarah gave birth to a daughter in March 1934, a small, perfect thing they named Grace. Joe held her in his arms in the cabin he'd built on a piece of land near the Virginia border and felt the weight of every decision he'd ever made settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. He looked at his daughter's face, so new and unmarked by the world's cruelty, and understood that he was damned. There was no walking away now. The men he worked for didn't offer retirement plans or gold watches. They offered silence and continued employment, and the alternative was a shallow grave in the woods. The years accumulated like scar tissue. Joe moved between two worlds, spending weeks in Pittsburgh handling Vincent's business, then returning to the mountains where Sarah and Grace waited in the cabin that was always too small and too cold in winter. He brought money, which Sarah accepted with increasing reluctance, and gifts for Grace, who grew from infant to toddler to little girl, without her father present for most of the milestones. He missed her first words, her first steps, the moment she learned to write her name in careful, crooked letters. Sarah grew harder. The softness that had attracted Joe to her calcified into something brittle and resentful. She stopped asking about his work, stopped pretending she didn't know what he did in the city. They spoke to each other with a careful politeness that was worse than anger, the kind of courtesy strangers use when forced to share a small space. The cabin filled with silence that felt like condemnation, punctuated by Grace's laughter, which sounded increasingly desperate, as if the child understood on some instinctive level that her presence was the only thing keeping her parents' marriage from complete collapse. In Pittsburgh, the organization was evolving. Vincent answered to men in New York, who answered to men in Chicago and Kansas City and Los Angeles, a network of families and crews that controlled everything from waterfront shipping to political appointments. The money flowed upward, always upward, and the men at the bottom, men like Joe, existed to ensure that flow continued uninterrupted. They collected debts from small business owners who couldn't afford to pay. They convinced union leaders to accept certain candidates, to support certain strikes, and abandon others. They removed obstacles, which was the polite way of saying they hurt people, sometimes badly, sometimes permanently. Joe discovered he was good at it, not because he enjoyed the violence. He didn't, not really, though there was a certain clarity in physical confrontation that appealed to him, but because he could make people understand the consequences of their choices without resorting to extremes. He had a way of speaking, quiet and reasonable, that made men twice his size agree to things they'd sworn they never would. Vincent appreciated this quality, this ability to solve problems with minimal noise, and Joe's reputation grew accordingly. But reputation in that world was a double-edged weapon. The more valuable you became, the more dangerous you were, and the more carefully you needed to be watched. Joe understood this. He kept his head down, did his work, took his money, and tried not to think too much about what it all meant. At night, when sleep wouldn't come, he would lie in whatever hotel room or rented apartment he was occupying and stare at the ceiling and think about Grace, about the kind of father he was becoming, about the lessons she was learning from his absences. In 1939, war broke out in Europe, and within 2 years America was drawn into the conflict. Joe was 30 years old, married with a child, technically eligible for deferment. But Vincent suggested, and in that world suggestions from men like Vincent were orders delivered politely, that Joe might want to volunteer for military service. The organization had connections in the War Department, ways of ensuring that certain men ended up in certain positions where they could be useful. Joe enlisted in the Army in December 1941, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and found himself assigned to the Quartermaster Corps, which handled supply logistics. For 3 years, Joe worked in North Africa and then Italy, managing warehouses, coordinating shipments, and occasionally diverting supplies into black market channels that fed money back to Vincent's organization. It was almost respectable work, considering. The military ran on corruption as surely as it ran on fuel and ammunition, and Joe was simply facilitating that natural process. He saw combat twice, both times by accident when supply convoys were ambushed, and discovered that killing a man with official sanction felt different than the violence he'd inflicted in Pittsburgh, though he couldn't quite articulate how. He returned to the States in 1945, decorated with a Bronze Star he didn't deserve for an act of courage he didn't remember committing. Grace was 11 years old, and when Joe walked into the cabin after 3 years away, she looked at him with the careful suspicion of a child meeting a stranger who claims to be family. Sarah had aged badly, her red hair streaked with gray, her green eyes hard as river stones. The cabin felt smaller than ever, suffocating in its familiarity and strangeness both. Joe tried. He stayed in the mountains for 6 months, working odd jobs, helping Sarah's father at the general store, attending Grace's school events and church services, where he felt like an imposter pretending at normalcy. But the mountains weren't home anymore, if they ever had been. Home was the sound of the city, the weight of work that required him to be someone other than himself, the clarity of purpose that came from serving men who expected nothing from him except obedience and silence. Vincent welcomed him back like a son, embraced him in the social club where everything and nothing had changed. The old man was grayer, thicker around the middle, but his eyes still missed nothing. He set Joe up with an apartment in Oakland, a neighborhood that had changed during the war, and gave him new responsibilities. The organization was expanding into legitimate businesses, construction, trucking, waste management, which required the same skills Joe had always possessed, just applied with slightly more subtlety. Joe fell into the rhythm easily. Too easily. He visited Sarah and Grace once a month, bringing money and guilt in equal measure, staying for a weekend that felt longer than the weeks between visits. Grace was growing into a young woman, sharp and observant, and she watched her father with eyes that saw too much. She asked him once, when she was 13, what he did in the city that kept him away so much. Joe told her he worked in logistics, which was true enough. She didn't believe him, which was also true enough. The trouble started in the summer of 1952, though Joe didn't recognize it as trouble until much later, until the pattern had already been established and the consequences were set in motion. Vincent called him into the office at the social club and introduced him to a man named Anthony Benedetto, who went by Tony Benedict for purposes of sounding less Italian in certain business contexts. Tony was perhaps 40, sleek and confident, with the kind of smile that suggested he was always 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. Tony had been operating in Youngstown and Cleveland, handling labor relations for the organization, which meant he convinced union leaders and factory owners to see things from a particular perspective. He was good at his work, successful enough to attract attention from New York, which was both an honor and a warning. The families in New York liked successful men right up until those men became too successful, too visible, too independent. Tony needed to diversify, to establish new operations in territory that was quieter, less scrutinized. He'd been looking at West Virginia, at the coal regions where labor disputes were constant and violent and easily manipulated by men who understood the right pressures to apply. Vincent suggested that Joe might be useful to Tony, given his connections in the mountains, his understanding of the local culture, his reputation for reliability. It wasn't really a suggestion, of course. Joe agreed because agreement was the only option, and because the money Tony offered was substantial enough to matter. He told himself this would be the last job, the final score that would let him buy a proper house for Sarah and Grace. That would finally make good on promises he'd been making for 20 years. Tony Benedict was everything Joe wasn't. Smooth, educated, comfortable in the boardrooms and country clubs where real power was exercised quietly. He spoke about the work they were doing as if it were a legitimate business venture, using terms like market penetration and strategic positioning and labor relations optimization. He had plans, strategies, visions for an empire built on the bones of the coal industry, which was dying slowly, but still generated enormous amounts of money for men who knew how to extract it. They started small, establishing relationships with union leaders in Logan and Mingo counties, offering financial support in exchange for influence over strike decisions and contract negotiations. The coal companies were desperate, squeezed between declining demand and rising labor costs, and desperate men made accommodating partners. Within a year, Tony and Joe had their hands in a dozen different operations, legitimate businesses, under-the-table deals, labor consulting firms that existed primarily on paper. The money was extraordinary. Joe was making more in a month than he'd made in a year working for Vincent, and he funneled most of it back to Sarah, who accepted it without comment and used it to renovate the cabin, to send Grace to a better school in Charleston, to build a life that looked respectable from the outside. Grace graduated high school in 1953, near the top of her class, and was accepted to the University of Virginia on a partial scholarship that Joe's money made feasible. He attended her graduation, sat in the back of the auditorium while she gave a speech about opportunity and perseverance, and felt a pride so fierce it was almost painful. But Tony Benedict was getting ambitious. And ambitious men in that world tended to burn bright and die young. He wanted to expand beyond West Virginia, into Kentucky and Tennessee, into territory that was already claimed by other organizations. He talked about coordination, about working together, about sharing the wealth. What he meant, though everyone understood this without saying it aloud, was that he wanted to take what others had built and claim it for himself, with the backing of the Pittsburgh family and their connections in New York. Vincent advised caution. The old man had survived 30 years in the life by understanding when to push and when to retreat, when to fight, and when to accept that some territories weren't worth the cost of claiming them. But Tony didn't listen. And Joe, caught between the two men, found himself carrying messages that felt increasingly like threats, making arrangements that felt increasingly like preparations for war. The first body turned up in October 1953, a Union leader from Harlan County, Kentucky, found in his car at the bottom of a ravine with a bullet in his head. The local police called it an accident, which everyone knew was a lie, but the lie was accepted because the truth would have been too expensive. 2 months later, another man disappeared, this one a businessman from Bristol, Tennessee, who'd been negotiating with Tony and had apparently decided the terms weren't acceptable. He was never found, though rumors suggested he'd been fed into a coal furnace in a mine that had been closed for years. The violence escalated through 1954 and into 1955. Men died, businesses burned, witnesses changed their stories or developed sudden amnesia. Tony Benedict moved through it all with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable, that his connections and money would insulate him from consequences. Joe watched it happen with growing unease, recognizing the pattern, understanding where it would lead. In the spring of 1955, Sarah was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. The doctors at the hospital in Charleston were kind but direct. The disease was advanced, the prognosis poor. She had perhaps a year, maybe less. Grace came home from university to help care for her mother, and Joe found himself spending more time in the mountains, watching Sarah diminish week by week, her body consuming itself from the inside. She never complained, never asked why this was happening to her. She'd spent too many years married to a man who dealt in consequences to believe that suffering required justification. Joe sat with her in the evenings, in the cabin that had never quite felt like home but now felt like the only place that mattered. And they talked about Grace, about the future, about small and safe topics that didn't require them to acknowledge the 23 years of distance and disappointment between them. Sarah asked him once near the end if he thought God kept accounts, if the things a man did in his life were weighed and judged after death. Joe didn't know how to answer that. He hoped not, but hope was a luxury he'd long since stopped affording himself. Sarah died on a Tuesday in December 1955, with Grace holding one hand and Joe holding the other, in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. They buried her in the Baptist cemetery near the church where they'd married, on a hillside overlooking the valley where she'd spent her entire life. Grace stood at the grave with tears running down her face, and Joe stood beside her with his heart full of regrets he couldn't voice and wouldn't have been forgiven for if he had. Grace returned to university after the funeral, and Joe threw himself into work with Tony Benedict, partly because work was all he knew how to do, and partly because the silence of the empty cabin was unbearable. The organization was thriving, if that was the right word for it. Tony controlled labor relations in 3 states now, had connections with politicians in Charleston and Frankfurt and Nashville, moved money through so many legitimate businesses that tracking it all required accountants and lawyers on permanent retainer. But success in that world attracted attention, and attention attracted problems. The FBI had been investigating organized crime with increasing intensity since the end of the war, building cases slowly and carefully, looking for cracks in the facade that men like Tony had built. Wiretaps, informants, grand juries. The federal government was learning to fight criminals with the same patient brutality that criminals used against each other. In March 1957, Tony called Joe to a meeting at a hotel in Wheeling, a neutral location away from their usual haunts. He seemed nervous, which was unlike him, kept looking out the window as if expecting to see someone watching. He told Joe that there were problems brewing, that certain people in New York were unhappy with how Tony was handling things, that there were rumors of investigations and indictments coming down. He needed to consolidate his position, to eliminate potential witnesses, to clean up loose ends. Joe understood what that meant. He'd done enough of this work over the years to recognize the pattern. Loose ends meant people who knew too much, who might talk if pressure was applied. It meant the union leaders Tony had corrupted, the businessmen he'd compromised, the lower-level operators who'd helped build his empire and who might now be liabilities. It meant bodies, a lot of them, and it meant crossing lines that Joe had always tried to avoid. He told Tony he needed time to think about it. Tony smiled that smooth, empty smile and said, "Of course, take all the time you need, but don't take too long." The implication was clear. Either Joe was with him, or he was one of the loose ends that needed cleaning up. Joe drove back to Pittsburgh that night and met with Vincent at the social club, in the office where he'd first started working 28 years earlier. The old man looked ancient now, shrunken inside an expensive suit, his hands trembling slightly when he poured espresso. Joe explained the situation, laid out Tony's plans, and asked for guidance. Vincent was quiet for a long time, staring at the wall where photographs hung, old pictures from the neighborhood, images of men who were long dead or long imprisoned. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with age and disappointment. Tony Benedict had become a problem, he said. The families in New York were concerned. The violence had attracted too much attention. The ambition had outpaced the wisdom. Decisions had been made. Tony would be dealt with, but it needed to be handled carefully, quietly, in a way that sent the right message without creating more problems. Joe understood. He was being asked to help kill Tony Benedict, the man who'd made him wealthy, who'd given him purpose after Sarah's death. But loyalty in that world was a complicated thing, layered with pragmatism and survival instinct. Vincent had protected Joe for nearly 3 decades. Tony had known Joe for 5 years. The math wasn't difficult. The arrangement was made for July 1958. Tony was planning a trip to inspect some operations in West Virginia, to meet with certain people about expanding into new territory. Joe would accompany him, would help set up the meetings, would ensure everything went smoothly. And at some point during that trip, in some quiet location far from witnesses and consequences, Tony Benedict would suffer an unfortunate accident. Joe spent the weeks leading up to it in a state of numbness that felt almost like peace. He visited Grace at university, took her to dinner, listened to her talk about her classes and her plans for law school, and her dreams of a life that had nothing to do with the mountains or the world her father inhabited. She was 24 years old, beautiful and fierce and completely foreign to him, and he understood that whatever happened next, this might be the last time he saw her. She asked him if everything was all right. He lied and said yes. She didn't believe him, but she didn't push, and they finished their meal in the companionable silence of 2 people who loved each other, but had never quite learned how to talk. Tony Benedict died on a Wednesday in July 1958, on a logging road in the Appalachian Mountains, 3 miles from the nearest town. Joe shot him once behind the left ear, while Tony was standing at the edge of a clearing, looking out over the valley and talking about expansion plans and future opportunities. The gun was a .38 revolver, untraceable, which Joe dropped into a creek 5 miles away. Tony fell forward without a sound, dead before his body hit the ground. Joe dragged the body into the trees, dug a shallow grave with a folding shovel he'd brought for the purpose, and covered it with pine branches and creek stones. The whole process took perhaps 40 minutes. A deer watched from the tree line, unconcerned with human violence, then disappeared into the forest. Joe drove Tony's car back to Pittsburgh, left it in a long-term parking lot at the train station, and took a bus back to the mountains. He expected to feel something: guilt, relief, horror, satisfaction. Instead, he felt nothing at all, just a vast emptiness that was worse than any emotion. He'd killed a man who trusted him, executed him like an animal, and the only thing he could think about was how easy it had been, how little ceremony the moment had required. Vincent called him 3 days later. The organization was satisfied. Tony's disappearance had been noted but not questioned too deeply. Men in that life vanished sometimes, and wise people didn't ask where they'd gone. Joe's work was appreciated. There would be a substantial payment, a bonus for handling a difficult situation with discretion. Did Joe want to stay involved with the business? Take over some of Tony's operations? Continue the work? Joe said no. He was done. He wanted out, wanted to disappear into the mountains and never return to Pittsburgh. Vincent was quiet for a moment, then said he understood that Joe had earned the right to walk away. But there were procedures to follow, arrangements to make, details to finalize. "Come to Pittsburgh one more time," Vincent said. "Just to make everything official, just to ensure there were no misunderstandings." Joe knew it was a trap. He'd been in the life long enough to recognize the pattern, the soft words and reasonable requests that preceded betrayal. Tony Benedict's death had solved one problem for the organization, but it had created another: Joe himself. He knew too much, had been involved in too many operations, represented too much potential exposure. Vincent liked him, perhaps even loved him in his way, but affection meant nothing against the mathematics of risk and liability. He could run. He had money saved, connections in places far from Pittsburgh and West Virginia. He could take Grace and disappear, build new lives under new names, spend whatever years remained looking over his shoulder and wondering when the past would catch up. But Grace had her own life now, her own dreams, and dragging her into his catastrophe would be the final unforgivable act in a lifetime of failures. So Joe did what he'd always done. He accepted the consequences of his choices. He drove to Pittsburgh on a Sunday in September 1958, met Vincent at the social club, and had a final conversation about old times and mutual respect. Vincent walked him to the door, embraced him like a father, and apologized for what came next. 2 men were waiting in the parking lot. Joe recognized one of them, a young enforcer named Carlo who'd come up through the organization in recent years, hungry and ambitious and untroubled by conscience. They didn't speak. Carlo simply gestured toward a car, and Joe got in the back seat and they drove out of the city into the hills where consequences were delivered far from witnesses. They took him to a warehouse in the suburbs, a place where concrete floors could be hosed clean and screams wouldn't carry to neighboring buildings. Carlo explained, almost apologetically, that they needed information first. Details about Tony Benedict's operations, the location of certain records, the names of people who might have become problems. Joe gave them what they wanted, not because torture frightened him, but because resistance seemed pointless. He'd spent 47 years running from judgment, and now it had arrived, and all he felt was tired. They beat him carefully, professionally, breaking ribs and fingers but avoiding the kind of damage that would cause internal bleeding or shock. They asked their questions, recorded his answers, and then, when they had what they needed, Carlo put a gun to the back of Joe's head and pulled the trigger. Except he didn't. At the last second, something shifted. A phone call, new instructions, a change in calculations. Instead of executing Joe in the warehouse, they drove him back into the mountains of West Virginia, back to the territory where he'd spent the last 20 years building and destroying, and they dumped him on a back road with a warning: leave Pittsburgh, stay gone, never speak about any of this. The organization was granting him a reprieve, but only one. If he ever returned, if he ever became a problem, if he ever gave them reason to reconsider, there would be no second chance. Joe never learned who intervened, Who made the call that saved his life? He suspected Vincent, one last act of loyalty from an old man who'd seen too much death and couldn't quite stomach one more. But he never confirmed it, never reached out, never tried to understand why he'd been spared when so many others hadn't. He returned to the cabin in the mountains, to the place where Sarah had died and Grace had grown up, and 23 years of failure had accumulated like silt at the bottom of a river. The cabin was empty, silent, full of ghosts that didn't need to be supernatural to haunt. Joe lived there for 6 weeks, drinking cheap whiskey and thinking about all the choices that had led him to this point, the 1,000 small compromises that had added up to damnation. He wrote a letter to Grace, trying to explain things he didn't fully understand himself, trying to apologize for everything and nothing. He burned it before finishing, understanding that some debts couldn't be paid with words. She deserved better than excuses from a man who'd spent her entire life choosing violence and money over presence and love. In October 1958, someone came for him. Not Carlo, not anyone from the organization. Someone else. Someone connected to one of the men whose deaths Joe had facilitated, whose blood was on Joe's hands, even if he hadn't pulled every trigger personally. The details don't matter. Revenge is revenge, and the specific grievance is less important than the inevitability. They took him 3 miles up that forgotten logging road to a clearing where sunlight never quite reached the forest floor. They bound his hands with piano wire, which cut into his wrists but not deeply enough to cause real damage, and they asked him questions he couldn't answer about money and operations and people who were already dead or disappeared. Joe told them what he knew, which wasn't much and wouldn't have helped them anyway. When they were finished talking, when they'd extracted whatever information or satisfaction they'd come for, they made him kneel in the dirt. Joe looked up at the trees, at the patches of sky visible through the canopy, and thought about Grace, about Sarah, about all the things he should have done differently and never would. He thought about the deer he'd seen the day he killed Tony Benedict, about how it had watched without judgment, without understanding that it was witnessing something terrible. The last thing he felt was relief. Just relief. Vast and overwhelming. That the running was finally over. That the weight he'd been carrying for 47 years could finally be set down. And then there was nothing at all. Just the sound of a single gunshot echoing through the mountains, fading into the forest until even that was gone. They found what was left of Joe Caruso on a Tuesday morning in October 1958, 3 miles up a forgotten logging road in the Appalachian foothills. Sheriff Dutch Kellerman stood over the grave with his hat in his hands and understood, with the clarity that comes from years of willful ignorance, that this was how these stories always ended. Not with justice or redemption, but with silence and dirt and the slow work of decay. The case file went into the basement of the county courthouse, marked unsolved, though everyone who needed to know understood exactly what had happened and why. Grace Caruso, by then a second-year law student at the University of Virginia, was notified of her father's death by a state trooper who drove to campus and delivered the news with the careful neutrality of someone who'd been briefed on the situation. She accepted it with the same resigned calm her father had shown in those final moments, as if she'd been expecting this news for years and was only surprised it had taken so long to arrive. She claimed the body, buried it next to her mother in the Baptist cemetery on the hillside overlooking the valley. She stood alone at the funeral. No one from Pittsburgh attended, no representatives from the organization, no friends or colleagues from Joe's years in the life. Just Grace and a minister who'd never met Joe and who delivered a generic eulogy about God's mercy and eternal rest. Grace didn't cry. She'd exhausted her tears years ago, mourning the father Joe might have been rather than the one he'd actually been. She finished law school, passed the bar, built a career prosecuting organized crime in federal court. She never married, never had children, dedicated herself to dismantling the same kind of operations her father had helped build. People who knew her story whispered that she was trying to atone for his sins, that she carried his guilt like a cross. But Grace knew better. She wasn't seeking redemption because redemption implied that the scales could somehow be balanced, that enough good work could erase the bad. She was simply ensuring that men like her father faced consequences, that the silence and complicity that had protected them for so long would finally break. It was small work, incremental, unsatisfying. For every man she helped convict, 10 more rose to take his place. The machine ground on, indifferent to individual prosecution, fed by the same hunger for money and power that had consumed Joe Caruso and Tony Benedict and Vincent Tagliatore and all the others. But Grace did the work anyway, year after year, case after case, because the alternative was accepting that her father's life had meant nothing, that his death had changed nothing, that the cycle would continue forever without interruption. And she couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept it, even though she knew in her heart that it was probably true. The mountains of West Virginia kept their secrets, as mountains always do. The logging road where Joe Caruso died grew over with weeds and saplings, becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. The cabin where he'd tried and failed to be a husband and father eventually collapsed, claimed by weather and time and the patient work of rot. The people who'd known him died or moved away or simply forgot, because memory is a luxury the past rarely affords. In Pittsburgh, Vincent Tagliatore died in his sleep in 1963, at the age of 76, surrounded by family and respected by the community as a successful businessman who'd made generous donations to charity and attended Mass every Sunday. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including several city council members and a state senator. No one mentioned his real work, the empire built on violence and corruption. Such things weren't discussed in polite company. The organization he'd helped build continued, evolved, adapted to changing times and new technologies. The men who ran it now wore different suits, used different methods, but the fundamental mathematics remained unchanged. There was money to be made from human weakness, from the spaces where law and morality broke down, and there would always be men willing to occupy those spaces regardless of cost. Joe the Mule Caruso's unsolved murder remained in the files of the West Virginia State Police, one of thousands of cold cases that would never be resolved. Sometimes, new investigators would pull the file, review the evidence, consider reopening the investigation, but the witnesses were dead or missing. The physical evidence was minimal, and the people who might have provided answers had long since learned that some questions were too expensive to answer honestly. Grace Caruso died in 2003, at the age of 69, of a heart attack while working late in her office at the Department of Justice. Her obituary mentioned her distinguished career, her numerous commendations, her dedication to public service. It didn't mention her father, or the cabin in the mountains, or the weight she'd carried every day of her adult life. Those stories died with her, becoming just another layer of silence in the accumulated history of violence and consequence. The mountains remain, indifferent and eternal, keeping their secrets beneath layers of stone and soil and time. The logging road is still there somewhere, invisible beneath decades of growth. The clearing where Joe Caruso spent his last moments still exists, though no marker indicates what happened there. No memorial acknowledges the life that ended on that October morning in 1958. This is how these stories end. Not with revelation or justice, but with forgetting, with the slow erasure of individual lives beneath the weight of continuing history. Joe Caruso was born, made choices, lived with consequences, and died badly. His daughter tried to balance the scales and failed, because the scales were never meant to balance. And the world moved on, as it always does, creating new victims and new perpetrators, and new stories that will also, eventually, be forgotten. The only thing that endures is the weight, the moral debt that accumulates across generations, the cost of choosing silence and complicity and survival over truth. That weight doesn't disappear with death. It transfers, finds new carriers, presses down on the living until they either break beneath it or learn to ignore it so completely that they don't even notice the burden anymore. And in the mountains of West Virginia, where the mist clings to the hillsides and the trees grow thick enough to hide anything, the forest keeps growing over the evidence of human failure. Nature doesn't judge, it simply consumes, transforms, erases, until even the memory of violence becomes part of the soil, nourishing new growth that knows nothing of the blood that feeds its roots. This is the story of Joe the Mule Caruso, not a tragedy, because tragedies imply nobility and choice and the possibility of different outcomes. This is simply what happens when ordinary people make ordinary compromises in a world built on violence and maintained through silence. This is the price of participation, the cost of survival, the wages of sin paid in full, with interest, across decades and generations. And somewhere in a courthouse basement in West Virginia, the file remains, yellowed and forgotten, marked unsolved. As if the word unsolved meant anything. As if the solution was ever in doubt. As if understanding who pulled the trigger would change the fundamental truth that Joe Caruso's death was simply the final installment on a debt he'd been paying his entire life, one choice at a time, until the balance came due and there was nothing left to pay with except his life. The story ends where it began, with a shallow grave in the mountains, with a man who knew it was coming, with a silence that spreads like poison through everyone who knows but won't speak. This is the real horror, not the violence itself, but the acceptance of it, the way it becomes normal, background noise, something people learn to live with until they forget they're living with it at all. And that forgetting, that comfortable, complicit amnesia, is the true crime, the one that goes unpunished and unprosecuted, the one that ensures the cycle continues, grinding on through decades and centuries, consuming lives and spitting out stories that no one wants to hear and everyone needs to remember. But memory requires witnesses willing to speak, and silence is always easier, always safer, always more profitable, so the stories get buried alongside the bodies, and the mountains keep their secrets, and the weight accumulates, pressing down on the living, waiting for the moment when it becomes too heavy to bear, and everything finally, inevitably, collapses beneath the burden of all that unacknowledged guilt. This is what remains of Joe the Mule Caruso, not a life but a warning that no one will heed, a lesson that no one will learn, a consequence that will repeat itself endlessly, because the machinery of violence runs on forgetting, on the willing blindness of people who know better but choose comfort over truth. And the mountains endure, silent and patient, bearing witness to crimes they'll never confess, hiding bodies they'll never surrender, keeping faith with the dead in ways the living never could.